You know, about the Weimar West-Eastern Divan workshop, there were about 70 or 80 young people from the Middle East, from the Arab countries and from Israel. And the first time when I walked on and I saw the orchestra, but as you were in the middle of a rehearsal of the Beethoven Seventh, the thing that struck me was how, I mean, obviously all of them had come from not only different backgrounds, but from very complicated circumstances, I suppose. You know, I mean, some are middle class, some are working class, some are Arabic speaking, some are Christian, some are Muslim, some are obviously from Syria, from Jordan, and so on. But at the moment that they were playing, in a strange sort of way, their personal identities and histories sort of dropped away. They become sort of irrelevant. And what's relevant is what they're doing towards you. Now, you know, when I give a lecture, of course, I see people in the same way. I just see them as a group. And only after time, I mean, there isn't much response in the same way that when you're conducting, there's, you know, immediate response. But do you feel the personalities of the people, or do you just feel them as the first violins or the second violins or something like that? In the beginning,
Yeah, no, of course. I mean, I think the situation is different from a lecture in the sense that in the lecture you provide the impetus. And they either absorb or don't, agree or disagree. They react, whereas here they act. The music sounds different when an orchestra reacts only to the conductor. You know, any professional conductor can make a willing professional orchestra play the way he wants. This is not music making. Music can only happen. I mean, it's after all the orchestra musicians who actually produce the sound. And in that respect, it is different. And I don't believe in seeing the orchestra as several groups: the first violins, the clarinets, the bass, etc. In the same way that I don't believe in seeing the pianist as having two units, two hands. It's either one unit, which is a combination of the two hands. In the orchestra, it's one unit, a combination of the whole orchestra, or 100 units of individuals, you know. And I believe very much that every musician in the orchestra conceives the music, or should conceive.
But in a certain sense, their backgrounds are irrelevant.
Totally irrelevant.
Totally irrelevant. Yeah.
Totally irrelevant, because I think that at the moment that they are playing, the unity is they in the music.
In the music, yeah. That's what's so fascinating about music, you know. I mean, as you and other musicians have described it, I mean, it is obviously like a language, but it's a language without the kinds of concepts that you find in, you know, spoken and written language. When you talk to a student, for example, in a class where you're teaching, let's say, a poem or a novel, the words mean something quite specific. I mean, you know, you talk about a glass, you talk about a lamp, you talk about a person. So there's a denotation there. And in that respect, the student immediately, his or her background becomes absolutely relevant to what they're saying. And they say it. You know, my own experience, this is, you know, this is simply untrue, or I can identify with this, or I hate this character, or something like that. Whereas in the music, there's obviously a very personal, you know, there's a very emotional kind of content to it, but it's not about the personal in the same way. It's about, I mean, it's as if it was, but it isn't really. It's kind of a paradox, don't you think?
Of course, but everything about music is paradoxical. But I think that the other difference, which is at least to me very, very interesting and maybe not unimportant, is that when you talk in language, you talk about a table. The person you're talking to doesn't only see that table, but the association of other tables that he has. Right. This is this is why I don't believe in when rehearsing with the orchestra to only give images, which are very entertaining and attractive to the musicians, and it makes it sort of easier to digest what you're trying to say. You know, it's like a wonderful landscape, or it is the running down, the horse falling, etc. I mean, every now and then, as a example of something entertaining, it can be said. But I think that the best results in the music are obtained when they are concentrated. And there's a difference between concentrated and being limited to the music. Concentrated on the musical language. Short, long, soft, sustained. All these are the elements, because this is really only in the sound. Everything that one says about music actually reflects on our reaction to it, not about music itself.
Right.
Music is emotional, is sensual, is rational, is mathematical, is philosophical. That doesn't speak about the music. It's all those things and more. It speaks about our reaction to it. And the best proof of that is that if you are in a joyful mood, the music sounds joyful and adds to your joyfulness. And if you are sad, the same piece becomes sad too. So therefore, I think the piece of music has everything that we talk about and more.
Well, that's in a way, the kind of magic of music that has made a lot of people, I won't say uncomfortable, but somehow they're thinking about music, I mean, the way Nietzsche thought about music or the way Plato thought about music. There's a slightly unsettling quality to it, because it can be so many things. I mean, you can't really tie it down. And music is also about movement. And it's about stimulation. I mean, there's no question about that. I mean, Tristan is such obviously the case. I mean, when you get to the end of Tristan, at least for the hearer, for the participant, I don't know what it's like for a singer to get through. But you really, as the poet has it, you're taken outside of yourself. I mean, there's a state of almost ecstasy in the literal sense of the word. And that can be dangerous, it can make you lose your reason. And I think that's one of the reasons, for example, that Plato, at the same time that he recognized, as did the Greeks, that music is associated with medicine. It has curative powers, but it can also have these other disturbing qualities. And, I often wonder what the effect on a musician, let's say, who spends a lot of his time, or her time, working on music that, in fact, takes you out of yourself. What does it mean to come back? I mean, you come back to the real world. And that back and forth must be also very unsettling, don't you think? I mean, as a listener, I feel it.
Yes, I think so. And I think this also explains why there are musicians that are musically intelligent and are not particularly intelligent are human beings, or are generous in their expression in the music and not. It can be separate. I don't think it has to be. But it can be separate. And there is, of course, something which, to me at least, gives an additional dimension to the music making, which maybe that speaks of the poorness of my spirit, or the poorness of my ability to come to terms with it, which I don't feel in everyday life, what you call real life. And that is the feeling that you are hanging, even though you are producing the sound, you hang yourself to the first sound when you play a piece of music, and you are, as it were, you are at the same time producing it, and still you hang on to it, and it carries you through a certain amount of time, and then it dies. And it is this feeling of death, of many deaths, which obviously you can't experience as a human being. I mean,
No, but you experience it as silence, basically. I mean, death is silence.
Yes.
So far as music is concerned.
As far as music is concerned.
Yeah, right.
But I think this is, in the end, when I think what is the dimension about music that is the most obvious over or above or other than real life, it is that this feeling of having, I have the feeling of having lived through a life, and it doesn't depend on the length or the scope of the piece. It is as true of Tristan as it is true of a work of Pierre Boulez, as it is true of a Chopin waltz. The fact that it starts out of nothing, out of the silence, and ends in nothing, gives it, for me, this dimension. And therefore, there is a constant intensity that one lives through in the music that is not possible to live in daily life. And I think this is the most difficult.
Don't you think it could be described as the other aspect of music, which is, I think, equally I don't know whether the right word is tragic, but I mean the tension in it. One is silence versus sound. You know, I mean the way the sound sort of takes you away from the silence, but then you know the silence is going to be returned. So it's like a suspension with a lot of intensity. But the other, I think, and that's one of the things that shares, say, with poetry, but not with painting, is that it happens and only happens once. That is to say, the time is in only one direction. And in a certain sense, of course you can in a rehearsal, but the actual performance of a piece of music and the flow of music, there's also something so inevitable about it, right? At the same time, that it's not recoverable, because once you've played it, it's gone. You can't, and all the attempts, I mean, I think, for me at any rate, all the attempts, you know, you've been involved with this more than anyone, I mean, all the attempts to record music, to try to preserve a moment, in a certain sense, something always gets left out, isn't it? I mean, and I think I experience it as a loss. You know, you have the experience, whether playing or listening, very intense, as you said, but then at the end it's over and you can't get it back. You know, it's like the concert that you did with these young musicians. You know, you worked on it for 2 weeks. The concert happens and it's over.
Oh, yeah.
You know, don't you? Do you feel that sense of sort of lassitude and loss, or perhaps you do it so often you don't feel it that way, because you know there's another one?
Well, yes, and I find although I think it takes courage, and it takes a lot of strength to really put bygones as bygones and really start every day from scratch. That is the most wonderful thing about it. Otherwise, it would be intolerable to play the same pieces again and again. But I don't feel I play the same. We played the Beethoven 7th yesterday evening with all these wonderful young people from the Middle East. And even if I don't have to go to another orchestra, if I were to play the same Beethoven 7th with them today or tomorrow, it would be different. I don't feel that we play the same piece.
Yeah. Well,
but I think the one thing I wanted still to say is that, I mean, I'm a great believer in paradoxes. I think that everything, of course, has its opposite, and it's only through the opposite that you understand the thing itself. Whether it is in the musical structure, in the sonata form, the one, let's say, masculine element and the feminine element, and not only they complement each other, but one, as it were, realizes itself through the contact with the other. I think this is very true, and I think that in a way, as a performing musician, there is, for me in any case, no better way than to forget myself and to forget the world and to forget everything than to play music. And yet, paradoxically, at the same time, never do I find that I understand myself and the world better than through the music. And I think that one should not be afraid of these paradoxes.
But you know, for some of the people in the orchestra, I was very aware of it, amongst obviously the Arab musicians, who come from a culture where Western music, I mean precisely the music I don't know about the Israelis, I assume for them Western music is their music. But I know for the Arabic musicians, you know, most of them are trained really as Western musician, as not an alternative, but a different form than the one they grew up with. As for me, I mean, the first things I heard were obviously the oud and, you know, the songs of Kulthum, which I loathed, as it turns out, but that's neither here nor there. It was familiar to me. And one of the things that I was very interested in this workshop was the extent to which they didn't forget that they come from another culture. I mean, they focused with great discipline on Beethoven and Mozart and so on. But at the same time, around them is their own music, you know, which I think that's also a kind of a paradox, or at least it's a let's say it's a tension, an unresolved tension.
Yeah,
there's no attempt really
to exclude.
Huh?
There's no attempt to exclude.
No, there's no attempt to exclude, but in fact, when they're doing one or the other, they're not doing both. They have to do one or the other. And I wondered, because I don't know enough about this generation, where they come from in Syria and so on, to what extent it represents a diminishment of their identity to be playing a music that's different from theirs. Is it simply professional, or I don't know. I mean, you've seen them around the world. Yes. I don't know.
No, but I mean, this is of course my first contact with a large group of Arab musicians. I have occasionally in my travels met the odd musician, but nothing to speak of. But very often during the time of the workshop, I took time to observe, how they were reacting. Obviously, to
you mean during
the rehearsals? During the rehearsals, right. And I don't think that there was one profile that can be tagged on to all of them, to all the Arabs. I think there was some where it was obvious that they were doing it with great passion and with great dedication, but you felt like people who speak a second language. And there were others...
Or that it's a translation from...
Or a translation.
From an original of some sort.
Yes. Yeah. And there were others that you felt it was their mother tongue. There were others where I felt they really... they think, like... I'm sure you are asked the same question. You speak so many languages. What language do you think in?
Well, you think in the one you're speaking.
In the one you're speaking. And there were some musicians who I felt were thinking in Western music. They were thinking in Beethoven. And there were others who were translating from other backgrounds. Right. Maybe subconsciously. Most probably.
Yeah, of course.
Most probably subconsciously. But such is the power of music, of sound first, and of music later, that it can totally get hold of them.
And you felt that they did. They were
absolutely.
At the end.
Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. And I was very impressed with the individual standards of the people. I think it is one of the best kept secrets, that there are so many talented Arab musicians. It is one of the best kept
It's one of the great catastrophes of I'm sorry to say, of the Arab governments, that they don't try to do more with these young people, because there's really, there's lots of talent. I have a feeling, by the way, I don't know, but I have a feeling that with the group we had here, we were scratching the surface. I mean, there must be... Don't you have that feeling also?
I am sure that there are in Cairo and in Damascus, there must be many more musicians who either didn't dare, because they were, at the beginning, of course, they were a little bit cautious, who either didn't dare to send a tape, or maybe it was too complicated and didn't have a machine to send a tape for the audition. And if I ever do this again, I'm going to make sure that somebody, sort of experts in the group, a musician, goes to those places and listens to them live. Yeah. But the number of Jewish musicians, performing musicians in the 20th century speaks for itself, how many there are and how many good ones. Therefore, it was natural in a way to expect that we would have this wonderful Israeli musicians and the Arabs who would sort of tag along, and there would be a few.
Yes, I remember we talked about that.
But there was nothing of that. There were some very good Israelis, and there were some less good Israelis, and there were some very good Arabs, and there were some less good Arabs. There was, in other words, there was a difference in the individual standards, obviously, but there wasn't. The difference was not a national or a group.
Yeah, right. But again, to get back to the distinctions of I'm not sure about the situation in Israel, whether now, for example, young musicians, when you were growing up, I mean, I don't know what young musicians did. Did they all plan to leave, or did they look forward to careers there? But these kids, the Arab kids, by contrast, music in our society is associated either with, the folk tradition, or I mean, there is a long, complicated history of Arabic music and theory and so on and so forth. But music is what people play and sing, and it's, fantastically popular through records and TV and so on and so forth. But when it comes to Western music, that's considered a luxury. That's considered, it's not something. So it's not something to invest in. So a lot of these kids, talking to them, Egypt is different because they have an opera house and they have a symphony. I mean, Egypt is the largest Arab country. So a lot of them have positions that they can look forward to perhaps staying in for a while. But the others in the smaller countries, and probably Syria too, you know, which is a major country, have no future. There isn't a sustaining institution in society to care for them. And that I think is a tragedy for us.
But you know, there's one other thing that they have in common. All the good musicians that were at this workshop, whether they were from Egypt, whether they were from Israel, or whether they were from Syria, they basically all want to leave the Middle East.
Yeah,
they want to go to America, or they want to go to Europe. And the question...
Did you get the impression, is it to leave or to leave for good?
For good. For good. For good. Because I don't think that they feel that they have today the standards that they can look forward to in Europe or in the United States, nor that they could really do something in order to achieve that. And probably this is the most important as far as music is concerned. If there is any kind of coexistence, real coexistence in the Middle East, I think this is a very strong common denominator, that a situation has to be created where the standards of orchestra playing are so high and the people are there. The people are there.
Performers are there.
Performers are there.
And one must assume audiences too.
And audiences too. Right. So that they don't feel that they have to go to Chicago or that they have to go to Berlin or even to London. You know, I mean, if you talk about Chicago Symphony or you talk about the Vienna Philharmonic, I understand this is the pinnacle, and it doesn't matter what part of the world you are. Yes. This is something that you can and should aspire to. But I mean, you know, they would go also to less important American or German orchestras, I think, to go. And there's no reason for this. And maybe this is something that we are obviously speaking ahead of the times, but if there is a real coexistence and not just a piece of paper, right. Not a piece of paper that brings some kind of cold peace, you know, like there is really between Israel and Egypt now. But if there is real coexistence, this is, as far as music is concerned, a very strong common denominator. I mean, I'm convinced after this experience, I'm convinced that you could really make an absolutely first-class Middle Eastern orchestra. Convinced.
Yeah, you see the advantage of it, and I think that's part of the spirit of what occurred here. Thinking back over it, you know, all the long period of going to visit the various countries and the difficulties with the bureaucracies and the individuals and so on and so forth. But in the end, I think what made it possible for Syrians and Egyptians and Palestinians and Jordanians and so on and so forth, I think were two things. Number one, I think a lot of them slipped through the cracks. In other words, in the end, they were not stopped by... I know this happened in Egypt, for example. There was some thing there about, you know, you have to do this, and the Minister of Culture, and that was a dead end. But the moment you started speaking to slightly lower officials, they understood this was a golden opportunity, you know, to work with, you know, people like you and Yo-Yo Ma and so on. So that's number one. And number two, I think probably even more important than that, is given the political climate, and there is now in the Arab world, I don't know whether you know this, but in the Arab world there's a tremendous debate. Certainly it's going on in Lebanon. It's certainly going on in Jordan. But nowhere more volubly than in Egypt about what is called normalization, which is normal relations with Israel, which has nothing to do with a peace process or even a peace agreement as Egypt has and Jordan has. On a popular level, it's just, there's nothing there. A, because these are papers written, negotiated between basically dictators on the Arab side, right? I mean, who did King Hussein talk to? His advisors and the Israelis and the Americans, but it wasn't given a popular basis. There was no referendum. In fact, I just wrote an article while I was here saying, you know, I mean, the disgrace of it now, that they're pressing forward with this final status thing in the Palestinians, and Arafat hasn't once said what the Israelis say about the Golan Heights, that we're going to have a referendum. Why don't we do the same thing? But anyway, that's another subject. But about the music, I think one of the reasons that in the end they accepted this was the fact that music isn't really political. It's not about normalization. In other words, you're not going to come out with a declaration of Weimar, right? I mean, all that is produced in the end is in effect a recital or an orchestral concert. And in that sense, it was, considered not normalization, but, something else.
The word Israeli is not necessarily only for a Syrian, somebody who is responsible for sending missiles over Damascus.
Right.
And same thing for the Israeli. Syrian is not some kind of animal that is geographically very close, but actually
worlds apart.
Yeah, right. And the same kind of thing. And I think that if this is so, then the Arab politicians are in for a bit of a surprise.
No, of course.
Because
That's
there were only a few of them, but they were very verbal and very clear about that.
Absolutely. I mean, their lives have been changed. I have no doubt of it. I don't think anybody who took part in this, on any level, whether as a conductor who didn't conduct, among the students, I mean, or a pianist who just played by himself, or occasionally had a master class with you, and certainly all the orchestral musicians who were playing together a lot of the time. But their lives have changed. There's no question about it, that whatever happened, they will not think the same way. Neither about music nor about anything else, in my opinion. So in that sense, music is a bit subversive.
Yes, of course it is.
At the same time that it seems harmless. Well, what have we got to lose? After all, there's no political content to this thing. So let's send them. I mean, in the end, and the Syrian government not only sent them but paid for them. So there was some very important dynamic there. But I think a lot of it was based on the idea that this is really not something that will have any great effect. I think it will have a great effect, because they will go back, and these are, after all, privileged in many ways, privileged young people, at least from the Arab world.
Are they mostly of well-to-do families?
I don't know well-to-do, but certainly middle class. I mean, they're not. I don't think that any of them were really working class, because you don't get to the violin or the flute or the oboe from a working class family. You see, I mean, there's a certain level. But I certainly don't think any of them that I could tell, at least from Egypt, that come from wealthy families. These are hard-working kids who've had to earn their way, and their families have sacrificed for them. That's certainly true among the Palestinian kids, all of them. It's partly true amongst the Jordanians. I mean, I don't quite know the setup in Jordan as to this new academy they have there. But in any case, I think that they will never think the same way about other people, and certainly not about Israelis, and about other Arabs. Don't forget that there isn't. When you talk about coexistence, I hope you're not only thinking about Arabs and Israelis.
Of course not.
No. Because there isn't much going on between Egyptians and Syrians in cultural terms. Everybody is cut off in his or her country, and I think this is an experience that certainly stirs things up. And I think something like it, in my opinion, should continue. Determinedly non-political, but subversive in the ways we've been discussing, don't you think?
Well, what for me was also very interesting, I mean, it was to be expected that the Syrians and the Israelis would be two different groups,
right.
Two different
They'd
societies.
circle around each other.
Two different societies,
yes.
But what was very, in the end, actually amusing, although it is not an amusing subject, was to see the relations between the different Palestinians, the Israeli Palestinians and, I don't know what you would call it, the Jordanian Palestinians.
Yeah, right. Were there were some from the West Bank.
Oh,
no, of course. All the Jordanians, I have to tell you, are all Palestinians.
Yes.
But they call, including Karim. I mean, I said to him last night, I said, well, why you're always identified as a Jordanian pianist? He said, well, I have a Jordanian passport. I said, okay, in that case, it's not a problem. But it's sort of interesting. But they are. Now, there were some people from the West Bank, but the two main groups are the ones who are really the most cut off from each other, the Palestinians from Jordan and the Palestinians from Israel.
From Israel. And the way you can really see, and at the beginning there was a little bit of, they were tentative. I noticed, for instance, some of the Israeli Palestinians would speak to me when they were alone with me in Hebrew, because they speak Hebrew perfectly. But in the groups, they would speak English, although everybody spoke. And as the days went along, they had no difficulty speak in Hebrew because Hebrew for them is easier than English.
Yeah, of course.
And they had absolutely...
And in some cases even easier than Arabic.
And in some cases easier than Arabic.
Yeah, because they get more Hebrew training than they do Arabic. I noticed that when I was there this year in Nazareth, there was a great concern amongst... I spoke to a very large meeting of Israeli Palestinians, young people, all postgraduates, who feel, the absence in their education of something that connects them to the Arab world. I mean, they're very connected to Israel. They're very combative, and of course they speak Hebrew, and they've gone to Hebrew university. These are all university graduates. But the one thing they don't have is a kind of lingua franca with their people outside Israel. Yeah, it's quite extraordinary. And one of the young Palestinians from Israel told me that for him the opportunity wasn't only, well, he's met Israelis before, and he's in an Israeli university, but for him the great opportunity was to meet Syrians.
Of course.
and Jordanians, no, Syrians in particular, and Egyptians, whom they never see.
And I think the a very important point is that for everyone, when you say that, you don't think that any of them will think the same way about anything, about themselves or about the others, or about the music, obviously. I think that the important thing is that it, in one stroke, did away for these people with the empty cliches that run around on both sides. On the Arab side about...
That's mainly what runs around, actually, is the cliches. Huh?
On both sides, and from the Israeli side, I don't feel qualified to speak about the Arab side. I've never actually been to an Arab country, much to my regret.
Well, we'll fix that.
I would love to. I would love to do that. Yes. I would love to do that.
Actually, this might not be a bad vehicle for it, to tell you the honest truth. West-Eastern Divan Orchestra,
To play in Cairo.
To play in Cairo, yeah. I mean, as a kind of, it is a German thing,
But the cliches in Israel of the Arabs, not even on the political thing, not about how they feel about Israel or how they feel about the Jews, but of being uneducated, rather stupid people, in the same way the jokes are made in France about the Belgians or in America about the Poles, all the things that are now politically incorrect, all this is gone.
Yeah.
I mean, when they heard Muhammad, the first oboe, play the Beethoven 7th, all the Israelis, I could see that, Not only was it humanly touching to see that they obviously wanted him to play well because he was part of the same group that they were playing in, but they were full of admiration that a boy from Egypt, nobody in his right mind in Israel would associate Egyptian people with oboe players playing the 7th Beethoven.
Actually, it's pretty surrealistic. Actually,
it is really, and you could see that, and this is very important.
Yeah. I'll tell you what. Two episodes. One with an Egyptian musician. I think he's a violinist. No, I know he's a violinist, and the other one is with an Israeli composer. Two separate conversations. So I said in talking with the Egyptian and just asking how are things going in the middle of the workshop. And he said, it's really quite something. Here's Barenboim, who's like a world-famous conductor and musician and so on. And he has absolutely it's no problem for us to talk to him. And he never throws his weight around and never says, you have to do this because I'm the boss or any of that stuff. He says in our society, a third-rate conductor or a fifth-rate professor, just because of the position and the title, feels that it's his right to be a bully and to dominate over it. So I think that was a very important lesson, that you can be great at what you do and that you have a certain kind of musical, you have a certain kind of human humility, or at least you're a normal person. So that was one. I thought that was very interesting because I know how hierarchical societies are, as you know them too. The other thing which amused me also was the Israeli composer who told me, I said, how has it been for you? And he's a conductor also, and some of the other musicians from Israel here. He said, well, it's a shock. I said, why? He said, leave aside the question of the other Arabs, for which we had no real preparation that they could play and so on and so forth, what you said about the oboist. The other thing, he said, it was a shock for us for Barenboim. I said, why? He said, two reasons. One, because he knows the score so well. We didn't expect, you know, all the conductors we worked with, you know, always looking at pages, and he never had a score in front of him, and that was a shock, you know, as to how he could do it so easily. And the second thing is that none of us here is going to be like him. So in a way, I thought it was quite sweet, you know, that it was, you know, this kind of disorientation, admiration, disorientation, and yet, you know, what a lucky person I am to have this experience. You must have felt it.
Well, you know, after all, they all come from the Orient, therefore it was my duty to disorient them.